My guest at this time is Mallory Quigley. She's the Vice President of Communications at the Susan B. Anthony list. She joins me today to respond to the Senate failing to reach 60 votes on a procedural vote on Monday that would have paved the way to a final vote on a bill that would require doctors to provide care for babies completely delivered from their mothers after a failed abortion attempt. And Mallory, thanks so much for being with us.
I really appreciate you having me on, Greg, and covering this important issue.
Well, again, this was what's known as a cloture vote. You have to get to 60 votes to get to the final vote, which would have been a simple majority, so it's a little bit complicated. But ultimately, it was a 53-44 vote. 3 Republicans didn't make the vote. At least 2 of those 3 say they would have voted for it. That was Tim Scott and Kevin Kramer. We're not sure about Lisa Murkowski, but Susan Collins did vote for it, so there's reason to think Murkowski may have. All the Democrats were there, though, and all except 3 voted against this bill. The ones voting in favor of it were Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and Doug Jones of Alabama. So we knew going into the vote that it was unlikely to get to 60. But what's your reaction nonetheless?
Yeah, well, I think that, there's beyond a shadow of a doubt, we understand now the agenda of the modern Democratic Party. I mean, the fact that Senator Collins voted for this bill is a good clue as to what it would truly do. I mean, this is not a bill about abortion. It's about infanticide and protecting babies that are born alive during failed abortions, like you said, completely separate entities from their moms. And what are we going to do with them? All this bill would do is require that those infants receive the same care that we would give and expect for a preemie baby born at the same stage. And Susan Collins, who's very pro-choice, she voted in support of this legislation. And so I think that's indicative of what the bill is about. But almost uniformly, the Senate Democrats voted against what this common sense, it's not just the morally right position to take on this. It's very popular. 77% of voters support this legislation. 55% strongly support it. So I don't know who, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, et cetera, who they think that they're representing. It's certainly a very small minority of people, and they're running for our nation's highest office. So I think that it is a terrible shame. It's really sickening and horrifying that this couldn't get, that this isn't the bipartisan vote that it should have been. And I think that the American people are going to be, they're not going to forget. This is something that's going to go down in the books, and people are going to remember come, election time.
We're talking with Mallory Quigley of the Susan B. Anthony list. And Mallory, let's walk briefly through some of the different reasons the Democrats gave for not supporting this legislation, starting with the argument that infanticide is already illegal. Back in the early 2000s, we had the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, which obviously bans active killing of children born after an attempted abortion. The argument here, I guess, is that it's different if you're not actively killing them. You're just not taking life-saving measures if that's not what the mother wants. What's your reaction?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the 2002 bill was really a statement about what we believe about these babies, but it didn't require anything. There were no legal teeth and no legal requirements. This bill, Senator Sass's bill, it gives moms a private right of action for when abortionists don't work actively to save the life of the unborn child. There needs to be some sort of legal requirement. I mean, think about it this way: the abortionist whose mission it has been throughout the procedure and before to ensure that this child's life is ended, what incentive do they have for taking care of a baby that when they've not done their job properly, when they've failed this procedure? So the bill requires that the infant be transported immediately to a hospital, treated the same way like any other preemie infant baby would be. And this is incredibly important. How vulnerable you couldn't be more vulnerable than a child that's just been born alive, and the person in the room that was trying to take your life now is the one that's supposed to be working on saving you. So we need to get this baby out of that situation and into a place where they can get the life-saving care that they need.
Patty Murray, who is the Democratic senator from Washington, who objected to the effort to pass this bill by unanimous consent a couple weeks ago, was also part of the debate on Monday and said, quote, this measure would force women to accept care that may directly conflict with your wishes at a deeply personal, often incredibly painful moment in your life because politicians in Washington decided their beliefs mattered more than yours. So how far do they believe their choice rights go? In other words, when does the baby have rights if it still doesn't have it when it's outside of the mother?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's a very important question. Like, are we talking about? I mean, it's clear to me in a statement like that, it's actually immensely helpful. It reveals with such clarity what the abortion lobby wants, which is a right to a dead child no matter what. And, there's so many other options for women. I mean, the example of Melissa Ohden, she herself was a baby that survived failed abortion. Her mom went in for a saline infusion abortion, which usually requires 3 days of the baby soaking in a toxic salt solution that's been injected into the womb before labor is induced and a dead child is delivered. And that she didn't just soak for 3 days, but actually for 5. And she was born alive despite all the odds. And so what does Senator Murray think ought to have happened to Melissa in that moment? She was taken by a nurse who heard her crying to the NICU, and then she was adopted. She's perfectly healthy now, has 2 children of her own, and is an advocate for people like her. There are many. She's connecting with all of them at abortionsurvivorsnetwork.com. And so what does Senator Murray want to happen to babies like Melissa? We're talking about infanticide, whether you're actively, cutting it's hard to talk about these things. It's so graphic. I can't even imagine, how did we get to this place in our nation that we're talking about this? But whether you're actively killing the baby like Kermit Gosnell, by snipping the backs of their necks, or you are leaving babies alone to die, and putting them in a soiled utility room, like Jill Stanek stumbled across this happening in her hospital in Chicago, Illinois, or you are doing what Planned Parenthood tells women who are going in and out for late-term abortion. If anything happens, put the fetus, because of course they can't call it a baby, put it in a bag and bring it to us. You know what I mean? This is such extreme depths of depravity. It's really horrifying that we're in a place where we have to have these conversations, but I'm thankful for the clarity, because at least having this conversation allows us to change people's hearts and minds.
Well, Mallory, there's other arguments that we heard on Monday from the Democrats for opposing this legislation. One was that it never happens, and so your story about Melissa Ohden certainly flies in the face of that. Another one we heard a lot is that they believe, or at least they argue, that this legislation could actually tie the hands of doctors about ways that they could potentially help these babies that survive abortions. What's your reaction to that?
I think all these doctors, they took an oath, the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm. So I think what they're doing in the first place with abortion is problematic in that regard. But there's just the senators have been bringing up these hard cases, talking about the reasons why women would be seeking late-term abortion when the child is viable. I think that we really need to take a step back and consider that we are not ourselves the author of life, and that if you're a religious person, and I think that this country was built on Judeo-Christian values, but I mean, I believe that, and many share this belief, that every person is created and loved by God and sent into the world with a specific purpose, and abortion disrupts that plan. There are just so many stories all over Facebook of babies who were born with trisomy 13 and anencephaly and just other ailments that may have caused them to have very short lives. But it's been documented beautifully, the peace and the joy, despite it being an incredibly difficult situation, the peace and the lasting lasting peace and joy that these families experience getting to meet their little boy or little girl, their siblings meeting their brother or sister, and for parents being allowed to parent for as long as is possible. And there's been numerous studies just from a perspective, studies done on families who have experienced perinatal hospice, chosen to carry their pregnancies to term, to give birth to the children, and then to just be parents for as long as possible with the support of perinatal hospice, and how much healthier that is for their families and for the marriages and for the mental health of the moms and dads. So I think that this is something that's really growing, this area of perinatal hospice, and I would like to see more attention brought to it because there's just so much evidence that this is the best option. And of course, it allows us to be creations, not try and imitate the creator by taking life as we see fit and making judgment calls about which lives are worth living and which ones aren't.
Let's talk about what happens next in this debate. Mallory, we talked about what happened in the Senate. That appears to likely be a done deal now for the rest of this Senate congressional session. But the House, the Republicans have tried it in the House as well. They've been denied a vote, I think, at least 5 times. What do you expect to happen here on Capitol Hill and into 2020?
Yes, for every day that they are in session, pro-life members of the House of Representatives are going down to the House floor asking for unanimous consent on this bill. They're also, Congressman Scalise is they're collecting signatures on a discharge petition, which essentially is going to, if they get enough signatures, allow them to force a vote despite Nancy Pelosi's wishes. So that's going to, quote unquote, ripen in a couple of weeks, and we hope that they can get enough signatures for a vote, because I think that the burden really lies with Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic caucus to explain to the American people why they're wrong to have such a visceral reaction to infanticide and late-term abortion, and why the 9% viewpoint is the right one. And if they're truly proud and comfortable with their line of arguments, then they'll allow a vote, and we'll get these members of Congress on the record on this. I think it's so important. This is the only way. Somebody asked me this morning whether or not this was a show vote, and absolutely not. I think that this, gets to the heart of who we are as a nation. We need to have the people who are pledging to represent us in Washington, to have them on the record on where they stand on infanticide and late-term abortion. And this is just an issue that we need to know where people stand. That way we can, vote accordingly in the upcoming elections.
And 2020, we know that will largely be cast as a referendum on Trump. How much do you think this issue will matter given all the noise that we're going to see in this presidential campaign?
I think it's going to make a huge difference. We know that it did in 2016. In the days leading up to Election Day, abortion and the candidates' names were among the most searched terms on Google. People were hungry for information about Donald Trump's position on abortion and Hillary Clinton's stand, and we got absolute clarity from both candidates, especially in that third presidential debate when Donald Trump, foreshadowed this moment, really. He talked about babies being ripped from their mother's wombs and the extreme support that Hillary Clinton has for late-term abortion. And that, I believe, was key to his success, because we know a majority of Americans support the common sense legislative proposals being put forward by the pro-life movement. And it's an absolute winning issue for him. I hope that he continues to talk about it, because the more clarity we have from the president and from his opponents, frankly, is the easier it's going to make easier it will be for us to make the case to voters in over the course of the next 16 to 18 months.
Given other issues, this hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and this really will be my last question. The president has also designated some changes to Title X, meaning Planned Parenthood would get about $50 to $60 million less. What's the significance of that?
Title X funding is Planned Parenthood's second largest source of taxpayer funding. And we were so thrilled with these new Title X regulations, the Protect Life rule being finalized on last Friday. This means that if Planned Parenthood refuses to comply, if they want to continue to co-locate their abortion centers in the same place where they're allegedly only focused on contraception, that they won't be eligible for this money, and they stand to lose $60 million. So I'm very encouraged by these rules being finalized, and it's underscores the president's commitment to pro-life issues, and he's really picking up the torch where Congress failed, frankly, when they were unable to defund Planned Parenthood through the reconciliation bill and get at their largest source of funding, which was Medicaid. So this is a huge victory for the pro-life movement, but it's certainly not a place where we're going to stop.
A busy week, and you've been very generous with your time, Mallory. Thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Greg. Talk to you soon.
You bet. Mallory Quigley, Vice President of Communications at the Susan B. Anthony List. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.